Some people enter your life as strangers, but their actions leave behind scars or lessons that change you forever. This is the story of how a man's deception nearly shattered a woman's dreams, until an unexpected twist turned everything around. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and let's dive into this incredible journey. It was a cold, windy morning when Clara adjusted her worn-out hat, shielding her face from the biting breeze. The once thriving farmland her father had nurtured now looked like a shadow of its former self. Rows of dry soil cracked like a broken mirror, mocking her efforts to hold on to a legacy that was slipping through her fingers. Her tired hands clutched the foreclosure notice, its bold letters screaming, "Final Notice." Clara's heart ached as she glanced at the old farmhouse, its peeling paint and sagging roof a painful reminder of how far they had fallen. Memories of her father teaching her to sow seeds filled her mind, and she whispered to herself, "I won't let it go, not like this." Just then, a shadow emerged at the edge of her property. A man in ragged clothes approached, his steps hesitant yet deliberate. Clara's instincts kicked in. She grabbed a nearby spade, her knuckles turning white as she called out, "Who's there? This is private property." The man stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but weary. "I'm not here to harm you. My name is Henry. I've been traveling for days and saw your farm. Thought I might find some work." Clara studied him, her sharp eyes scanning his tattered clothes and dusty boots. He looked harmless, but she couldn't shake the unease creeping into her chest. "I don't have anything to give," she said, her voice cold but firm. "Barely enough for myself." Henry nodded. "I understand. I'll work for food, anything you can spare." She hesitated, torn between distrust and the small, nagging voice inside her that said her father would have given the man a chance. Reluctantly, she stepped back and opened the gate. "Fine, but if you cause any trouble, I'll call the sheriff faster than you can blink." Henry smiled faintly, his face softening as he entered. "You won't regret it." As the day went on, Henry proved to be more capable than Clara expected. He fixed a broken fence and cleared debris from the barn without needing directions. Still, she couldn't help but notice the strange contradiction in his demeanor. His hands worked like those of a seasoned laborer, but his mannerisms carried an air of refinement, as though manual labor was foreign to him. That evening, as they sat on the porch with bowls of thin soup, Henry glanced at her and said, "You've got a strong spirit. Not many would keep fighting for land like this." Clara stiffened, her defenses rising. "It's none of your business." Henry nodded, sensing her boundaries, but as he watched her stare into the horizon, he couldn't help but wonder, what was she holding on to so fiercely, and why did it matter so much? The next morning, Clara awoke to the sound of hammering. She rubbed her eyes, confused, and stepped onto the porch to find Henry already hard at work fixing the broken steps leading up to the house. His movements were precise, efficient, and oddly graceful. Too graceful for someone who claimed to be a drifter. "What are you doing?" she asked, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Henry looked up, a faint smile on his face. "Your steps were loose. Figured I'd fix them before someone breaks their neck." Clara crossed her arms, unsure whether to feel grateful or irritated. "I didn't ask you to do that." "You didn't have to." He set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his trousers. The soup last night was payment enough. For a moment, Clara didn't respond. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, not since the farm had started to fall apart. The local townsfolk were quick to offer pity but slow to lend any real help. She sighed and turned back toward the house. "There's coffee on the stove. Help yourself if you want." Inside, Clara stared at the stack of bills on the kitchen table. Each envelope was a reminder of how close she was to losing everything. The farm had been her father's life's work, a testament to his belief that hard work and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. But no amount of perseverance could fight back against rising costs, a bad harvest, and a ruthless banker who seemed all too eager to take it away. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Hensley, her elderly neighbor, holding a plate of freshly baked biscuits. "I thought you could use a little something sweet," Mrs. Hensley said with a warm smile. Clara managed a small smile in return. "Thank you, Mrs. Hensley. You didn't have to." "Nonsense," the older woman replied, stepping inside. "How are you holding up, dear?" Her gaze shifted to the bills on the table, and her expression softened. Clara shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Same as always." Mrs. Hensley patted her arm gently. "You're a strong one, Clara. Your father would be proud of you." As they talked, Henry entered the kitchen, pausing awkwardly when he saw Mrs. Hensley. "And who's this?" Mrs. Hensley asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This is Henry," Clara said, glancing at him. "He's helping out around the farm for a while." Henry offered a polite nod. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Mrs. Hensley studied him for a moment before turning back to Clara. "Well, I hope he's more help than trouble." Henry chuckled softly. "I'll do my best." Later that day, Clara and Henry worked together to clear an overgrown section of the field. As they toiled under the midday sun, Clara found herself opening up more than she intended. "My dad built this farm from nothing," she said, her voice tinged with pride and sadness. "He used to say it wasn't just about the crops, it was about providing for the community." Henry listened intently, his usual air of detachment replaced by genuine interest. "What happened to him?" Clara hesitated, her hands tightening around the hoe. "Heart attack. 2 years ago. He worked himself to the bone trying to keep this place running." "I'm sorry," Henry said softly. Clara shrugged, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's just me now, and the bank breathing down my neck." She turned to him, her expression hardening. "But I'm not giving up, not until they take it from my cold, dead hands." Henry nodded, his respect for her growing. "You've got more fight in you than most people I've met." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a truck engine. Clara turned to see Tom, her childhood friend, pulling up to the barn in his old pickup. Tom jumped out, his face lighting up when he saw Clara. "Thought I'd swing by and see if you needed any help." Clara smiled, her mood lifting slightly. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it." Tom's eyes flicked to Henry, his smile fading. "Who's this?" "Henry," Clara said. "He's helping out for a bit." Tom's gaze lingered on Henry for a moment before he extended a hand. "Tom, I've known Clara since we were kids." Henry shook his hand, sensing the unspoken tension. "Nice to meet you." As the days passed, Henry became a regular fixture on the farm. He worked alongside Clara, fixed things that had been broken for years, and even helped her prepare for a small fundraiser to sell homemade jams and baked goods. The fundraiser was Clara's last-ditch effort to raise money before the foreclosure deadline, but turnout was sparse. Most of the townsfolk offered polite excuses, their words laced with pity. Mrs. Hensley bought a few jars of jam, pressing a few extra bills into Clara's hand with a whispered, "Don't lose hope, dear." By the end of the day, Clara counted the money and felt her chest tighten. It wasn't nearly enough. Henry watched her silently, his jaw clenched. He wanted to help, but every time he reached for his wallet, guilt stopped him. He couldn't reveal his true identity, not yet. That night, as Clara sat on the porch staring at the stars, Henry joined her. "You're going to make it," he said, his voice steady. Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How do you know?" Henry hesitated, then said, "Because you're stronger than you think." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. Over the next week, Clara and Henry fell into a rhythm. Each day began before dawn, with Clara leading the charge on whatever task needed doing, repairing fences, cleaning out the barn, or tending to the sparse fields. Henry followed without complaint, his quiet competence surprising Clara at every turn. But Clara wasn't the only one noticing Henry. One afternoon, Tom stopped by again, bringing spare parts for Clara's tractor. She greeted him with a relieved smile, thankful for his kindness. But Tom's attention quickly turned to Henry, who was working in the background. "Still here, huh?" Tom asked, his voice tight. Henry straightened and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Seems like there's always something that needs fixing." Tom crossed his arms. "Funny how you just showed up when Clara's at her most vulnerable." "Tom," Clara said sharply, stepping between them, "he's been nothing but helpful." Tom's face softened slightly as he turned to Clara. "I'm just saying, be careful, all right? Not everyone who offers help has good intentions." "I can take care of myself," Clara replied, though the words didn't entirely mask the hint of doubt in her voice. Henry didn't say anything, but the exchange left him uneasy. He couldn't deny that Tom had a point. He wasn't being entirely honest about why he was here. That evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table, poring over her father's old notebook. Its pages were filled with neat, handwritten notes, crop rotations, weather patterns, and random musings. Henry entered quietly, carrying a freshly chopped pile of firewood. "What's that?" he asked, setting the wood down by the stove. "My dad's notes," Clara replied without looking up. "He kept everything in here, weather forecasts, planting schedules, even his ideas for what the farm could be." Henry stepped closer, his eyes scanning the pages. One entry caught his attention. "There's more to this land than meets the eye. Potential beyond crops. If only I had the resources to explore it." "What did he mean by that?" Henry asked. Clara shrugged. "Who knows? My dad had a lot of big dreams. Most of them never went anywhere." Henry frowned, but he didn't press further. He knew exactly what Clara's father had meant. He had seen the geological reports. The farm sat on top of a small but valuable oil reserve, and that was why Henry had come. But now, looking at Clara, he felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't some faceless seller he could manipulate. She was a person, fighting tooth and nail to protect something that mattered deeply to her. The next morning, Clara received a letter from the bank. She tore it open with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the page. "They're moving up the auction date," she said, her voice hollow. "I have 10 days. Henry set down the tool he was holding, his stomach twisting. "What are you going to do?" Clara laughed bitterly. "What can I do? Bake more pies? Sell more jam? It's hopeless." "It's not hopeless," Henry said firmly. "There's still time." "For what?" Clara shot back. "For a miracle?" Henry wanted to tell her the truth right then, that he had the money to buy the farm and more, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, "We'll figure something out." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Clara worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for one final fundraiser, a community dinner in the barn. She decorated the space with twinkling lights, borrowed from Mrs. Hensley, and set up tables with mismatched chairs from her neighbors. Henry helped without complaint, his admiration for Clara growing with every passing hour. But he couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Clara was running on fumes, and the weight of her situation was becoming unbearable. The night of the dinner arrived, and Clara stood at the entrance to the barn, greeting the few guests who trickled in. Mrs. Hensley brought a casserole, Tom donated some supplies, and a handful of others contributed what they could. But the turnout was underwhelming. Most of the townsfolk stayed away, unwilling to support a cause they believed was already lost. Clara did her best to hide her disappointment, smiling and thanking the guests who came. But as the night wore on, it became clear that the fundraiser wouldn't bring in nearly enough money. At the end of the evening, Clara sat alone on the porch, staring at the ledger in her lap. She was $5,000 short, and there was no way to make up the difference in time. Henry joined her, sitting silently by her side. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Clara didn't look at him. "It's not your fault. This was my fight, and I lost." "You didn't lose," Henry said. "Not yet." Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with frustration and sorrow. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Henry hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I've seen what happens when people like you lose. The world gets a little darker, a little colder, and I don't want that to happen." For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then, to Henry's surprise, she leaned her head against his shoulder, her exhaustion finally overtaking her. The next morning, Clara woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She spent the day calling local businesses, asking for donations, and even put up flyers around town. Henry watched her with a mix of admiration and guilt. He knew she was fighting a losing battle, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. That evening, Tom arrived with a small group of volunteers to help clean up the barn. Clara was touched by their support, but the tension between Tom and Henry was palpable. "Are you sticking around for good?" Tom asked Henry as they worked side by side. "I go where I'm needed," Henry replied evenly. Tom narrowed his eyes. "Well, Clara doesn't need more trouble." Henry said nothing, but his jaw tightened. As the days counted down to the auction, the weight of the situation pressed down on everyone. Clara worked harder than ever, pouring every ounce of herself into saving the farm. But Henry could see the cracks forming, both in the farm and in Clara herself. And he knew that if something didn't change soon, everything she'd worked for would be lost. The days leading up to the auction seemed to pass in a blur. Clara worked tirelessly, trying every last trick she could think of to raise the money she needed. She baked pies, sold vegetables at the local market, and even offered to take odd jobs around town. But no matter how much she pushed herself, the gap between what she had and what she needed felt insurmountable. Henry watched her with a growing sense of unease. He admired her determination, but he couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on her. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep, and her once strong voice cracked under the weight of her exhaustion. One afternoon, Clara sat on the porch with Mrs. Hensley, who had brought over another casserole. The older woman gently placed her hand over Clara's. "You're wearing yourself out, child," Mrs. Hensley said softly. "Your father wouldn't want this." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "What else can I do, Mrs. Hensley? I can't just let them take the farm." Mrs. Hensley sighed and glanced at Henry, who had been standing silently nearby. "You've got help now," she said, nodding toward him. "Maybe it's time to lean on someone for a change." Clara glanced at Henry, her expression unreadable. "I don't even know him," she said quietly. Henry took a step forward, his voice steady. "You don't have to trust me, Clara, but you don't have to do this alone." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Henry sat on the porch, staring out at the darkening fields. Henry finally broke the silence. "Clara, there's something you should know." She turned to him, her eyes wary. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the roar of an engine interrupted them. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the farmhouse, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. It was Mr. Grayson, the banker. Clara's fists clenched at her sides as Grayson approached, his smirk dripping with condescension. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice oily, "I wanted to give you a friendly reminder about the auction." "You didn't need to come here for that," Clara said coldly. "I know when it is." Grayson's smirk widened. "I just thought you should know. There's already considerable interest in your land. Developers, mostly. They see great potential here." Henry stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You mean they see dollar signs," he said, his voice sharp. Grayson turned to Henry, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" "Someone who cares more about this farm than you ever will," Henry shot back. Grayson ignored him and turned back to Clara. "I'll see you at the auction," he said, his tone smug. "Good luck, you'll need it." As Grayson drove away, Clara sank into one of the porch chairs, her head in her hands. "I hate him," she whispered. "I hate all of this." Henry crouched in front of her, his voice gentle. "Clara, listen to me. He's wrong about one thing. You don't need luck. You've got something better. You've got fight." The days continued to tick by, and the tension on the farm grew thicker with each passing hour. The townsfolk who had once been indifferent began to rally around Clara. Mrs. Hensley organized a bake sale, and Tom convinced some of the local businesses to donate supplies for another fundraiser. Even the usually gossipy neighbors began pitching in, bringing over small donations or helping with repairs. Clara was touched by the sudden wave of support, but it wasn't enough to ease her anxiety. The auction was now only 3 days away, and she was still short of her goal. One night, as Henry sat alone in the barn, he pulled out his phone. For weeks, he had avoided any connection to his old life, but now he found himself scrolling through his emails. Among the dozens of messages from his business associates was one from his assistant, reminding him of an upcoming deal, one that could secure him millions if he played his cards right. But for the first time, the thought of more money didn't excite him. Instead, it felt hollow, meaningless. He stared at the phone for a long time before finally shutting it off. The day before the auction, Clara stood in the barn, organizing the last of the fundraiser items. Henry approached her, his expression serious. "Clara, I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the barn door slammed open. Tom burst in, his face red with anger. "Clara," he said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. "Did you know about this?" Clara took the paper from him, her eyes scanning the text. It was a geological survey of her land, detailing the potential oil reserves beneath it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Tom pointed at Henry. "Ask him." Clara turned to Henry, her eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. "Henry, what is he talking about?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. "You knew, didn't you?" Clara said, her voice rising. "You knew about the oil, and you didn't tell me." Henry finally spoke, his voice low. "Yes, I knew." Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the paper. "And you were just going to let me lose everything?" "No," Henry said, stepping closer. "Clara, I was trying to help." "Help?" Clara laughed bitterly. "You lied to me, Henry. You let me believe you were here to help when all you cared about was what you could take." "That's not true," Henry said, his voice pleading. "I care about you, Clara, more than I've ever cared about anything." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Get off my farm." Henry's heart sank, but he nodded, knowing he had no right to argue. As he walked away, he turned back one last time. "Clara, I'll fix this, I promise." That night, Clara sat alone in the kitchen staring at the geological survey. She felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, but beneath it all was a small glimmer of hope. If the survey was accurate, her farm was worth more than she had ever imagined. But that hope was tempered by doubt. Could she trust anything Henry had told her? And even if the oil reserves were real, how could she possibly save the farm in time? Meanwhile, Henry sat in a dingy motel room on the edge of town, his mind racing. He knew he had to do something to make things right, but he also knew that nothing he said could erase the pain he had caused Clara. As he stared out the window, an idea began to form. It was risky, and it would require everything he had, but it might be the only way to save Clara's farm and her faith in him. With renewed determination, Henry grabbed his phone and started making calls. The morning of the auction arrived, and the atmosphere on the farm was tense. Clara stood by the barn, watching as her neighbors gathered in small clusters, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Hensley was by her side, holding her hand tightly, while Tom paced back and forth, his frustration barely concealed. "You don't have to go through with this," Tom said, his voice low. "We can fight them in court. There has to be another way." Clara shook her head. "There's no time, Tom. This is it. I either come up with the money today or the farm is gone." Her words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Clara felt truly defeated. Despite all her efforts, she was still short of her goal, and she knew that Mr. Grayson and the developers would pounce on her land the moment the bidding started. The auctioneer arrived shortly after noon, accompanied by Mr. Grayson and a handful of men in expensive suits. Clara's stomach churned as she watched them laugh and joke, as though her entire life's work was nothing more than a game to them. As the crowd gathered, the auctioneer called for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting the auction shortly. Please make sure you've registered your bids." Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling. Mrs. Hensley gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're not alone, dear. We're all here for you." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. No matter how much support she had, this was her fight, and she was about to lose. Just as the auctioneer began his introduction, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the crowd. The door opened, and Henry stepped out, his expression calm but resolute. He was no longer wearing his worn-out clothes. Instead, he was dressed in a sharp suit that seemed completely out of place in the rural setting. The crowd fell silent, their attention shifting to him. Clara's eyes widened in shock as he approached, his gaze fixed on her. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "I told you I'd fix this," Henry said simply. Before Clara could respond, Henry turned to the auctioneer. "I'd like to register as a bidder." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Tom stepped forward, his face red with anger. "What the hell are you doing, Henry? Haven't you caused enough damage?" Henry ignored him, his focus entirely on Clara. "Trust me," he said softly. "Just this once." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to yell at him, to demand answers, but something in his eyes stopped her. Against her better judgment, she nodded. The auction began, and the bids came fast and furious. The developers, represented by Mr. Grayson, were aggressive, driving the price higher and higher. Clara could only watch helplessly as the numbers climbed far beyond anything she could afford. But Henry didn't back down. Each time the developers placed a bid, he countered without hesitation. "What's he doing?" Tom muttered, his jaw clenched. "I don't know," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the bidding continued, it became clear that Henry was determined to win. The developers exchanged uneasy glances, and even Mr. Grayson's smug demeanor began to waver. If you are enjoying the story till now, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue. Finally, the auctioneer called for the final bid. Henry raised his hand, offering a number so high that the developers fell silent. "Going once, going twice, sold," the auctioneer announced, slamming his gavel down. The crowd erupted into murmurs, and all eyes turned to Henry. Clara felt her knees weaken as the weight of what had just happened sank in. After the crowd began to disperse, Henry approached Clara, his expression unreadable. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I bought your farm," Henry said simply. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "So that's it? You just take everything and I'm supposed to thank you?" Henry shook his head. "You don't understand. I didn't buy it for me. I bought it for you." "What?" Clara whispered, her breath catching. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is the deed. It's yours. No strings attached." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "Why would you do that?" Henry took a deep breath, his voice steady. "Because you deserve it. Because this farm means more to you than it ever could to anyone else, and because I was wrong." Clara blinked back tears, her heart pounding. "But why lie to me? Why pretend to be someone you're not?" Henry hesitated, then said, "At first I thought this was just a business deal. The land, the oil. It was all about profit. But then I met you, and I saw how much this place meant to you. It changed everything." Clara looked away, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, gratitude, and confusion. "I don't know if I can forgive you for lying." "You don't have to," Henry said softly, "but I hope one day you'll understand why I did it." The next few days were a blur. News of Henry's actions spread quickly through the town and opinions were divided. Some praised him for saving the farm, while others questioned his motives. Clara remained distant, unsure of how to feel. She spent her days working on the farm, pouring her energy into restoring what had been neglected. Henry, true to his word, stayed away, leaving her to process everything on her own. One evening, Clara found herself standing by the fence at the edge of her property, staring out at the horizon. She thought about her father, about the legacy he had left behind, and about the man who had saved it, even if his methods had been questionable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she made a decision. The next morning, she drove into town and found Henry at the local diner. He looked up as she approached, his expression cautious. "Can I sit?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Of course." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said, "I don't know if I'll ever completely trust you, but I do know one thing. You kept your promise." Henry's lips curved into a small smile. "That's all I wanted." Henry leaned back in his seat at the diner, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. Clara's presence across the table was more than he had expected. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure she'd ever want to speak to him again. Clara folded her hands on the table, her expression still guarded. "I need to understand," she began. "Why did you come here in the first place? And don't sugarcoat it. I deserve the truth." Henry took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "You're right. You do. When I first came here, it was about business. I heard about the oil reserves on your land and thought I could get it for a fraction of what it's worth by playing a role." He hesitated, then added, "I lied to you, Clara. There's no excuse for that." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "But as I got to know you, everything changed," Henry continued. "I saw how much this farm meant to you, how hard you were fighting for it. You weren't just holding on to land. You were holding on to your father's dream, your identity, your community. And it made me question everything I've ever believed about what really matters." Clara's eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "So, what? You suddenly grew a conscience?" Henry nodded slowly. "Something like that. I've spent my whole life chasing money, Clara, building wealth, making deals, winning at all costs, but for the first time I realize that none of it means anything if it comes at the expense of someone else's happiness." The conversation left Clara with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Henry's actions, however flawed, had been driven by something more than greed. She couldn't bring herself to fully trust him yet, but a small part of her wanted to believe that he was sincere. Back at the farm, Clara threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. The land was hers again, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The neighbors who had once whispered behind her back now stopped by with offers to help. Tom, despite his lingering distrust of Henry, rallied volunteers to repair the barn roof and clear the overgrown fields. The transformation of the farm mirrored Clara's own journey. She was no longer just surviving. She was rebuilding. 1 week later, a small group gathered at the farm to celebrate its revival. The barn was strung with lights, the tables laden with homemade dishes, and the air filled with laughter. Clara moved through the crowd, greeting her neighbors and thanking them for their support. Henry arrived late, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. He didn't want to intrude, but he couldn't resist seeing the farm in its renewed glory. When Clara spotted him, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. Henry smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "You've done a lot for this place, Henry, and for me. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why, but thank you." "It was never about the farm, Clara," Henry said, his voice low. "It was about you." Before she could respond, a loud voice interrupted them. Mr. Grayson stood near the barn, his face flushed with anger. "Enjoying your little party, Miss Carter? Don't get too comfortable. That oil beneath your land won't stay hidden forever." The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to Clara and Henry. Grayson's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to undo everything Clara had fought for. Henry stepped forward, his expression cold and unyielding. "The oil isn't hidden, Grayson, and it's none of your business anymore." Grayson sneered. "You think you've won? That land is sitting on a gold mine and developers will keep coming until it's theirs." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Henry said sharply. "The farm is protected now, under Clara's name, and no amount of money will change that." The crowd murmured in agreement, their loyalty to Clara unwavering. Grayson, realizing he was outnumbered, muttered something under his breath and stormed off. Clara let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "Is it always like this with you?" she asked Henry, her voice half joking, half serious. Henry chuckled softly. "Only when it matters." As the evening wound down, Clara found herself standing by the fence, staring out at the horizon. Henry joined her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You're going to be okay, you know," he said. Clara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think I finally believed that." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling into the quiet night. Then Clara turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're not as terrible as I thought you were." Henry laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'll take that as a compliment." As Henry prepared to leave the next morning, Clara approached him by his car. "You don't have to go, you know," she said hesitantly. Henry shook his head, his smile tinged with sadness. "This is your home, Clara, not mine, but I'll be around if you ever need me." Clara nodded, her heart heavy but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. "Take care of yourself, Henry." "You too," he said softly, before climbing into the car and driving away. The farm slowly returned to life, becoming a beacon of hope in the small, tight-knit community. Clara worked tirelessly, her determination stronger than ever. But now, it wasn't just about saving the farm. It was about building something her father would have been proud of. With the threat of foreclosure gone, Clara could finally focus on the future. The barn, once a symbol of despair, now stood tall and sturdy, thanks to the collective effort of her neighbors. Fresh crops were beginning to sprout in the fields, a tangible sign of renewal and growth. The townsfolk, inspired by Clara's perseverance, began to rally around her. Mrs. Hensley became her unofficial advisor, offering wisdom and encouragement at every turn. Tom, despite his earlier skepticism, became a steadfast partner, helping Clara with the more challenging repairs and even brainstorming ways to diversify the farm's income. One day, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was from Henry. She unfolded the paper carefully, her heart pounding. "Clara, I hope this letter finds you well. Leaving the farm was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was the right decision. You're the heart of that place, and I had no right to be a part of it after what I did. Still, I wanted you to know that I've set up a trust fund for the farm. It's enough to cover any future emergencies and ensure you never have to face what you went through again. You taught me something I never expected to learn, the value of roots. I've spent my life chasing opportunities, but you showed me the importance of holding on to something that truly matters. Take care of yourself, Clara. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Henry." Clara held the letter to her chest, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, sadness, and hope. For all his flaws, Henry had proven himself to be someone she could respect, even if their paths had ultimately diverged. Months later, the farm had its first bumper harvest in years. Clara invited the entire community to celebrate, hosting a festival on the property. The barn was decorated with fairy lights, and the fields were filled with laughter, music, and the smell of fresh-baked pies. As Clara looked around at the smiling faces of her friends and neighbors, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her father's dream had been saved, not just by her own efforts, but by the people who had come together to support her. As the sun set over the farm, Clara stood at the edge of the fields, staring out at the horizon. She thought of her father, of the challenges she had overcome, and of Henry. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the gentle breeze. For the first time in years, she felt truly free.